Mum, we're moving your things to the back office. It's time for a more modern look up front. The words hit me like a slap. I was standing in the front office of Henderson Hardware, the little glass-walled room my Frank and I had built with our own hands. My son, David, stood in the doorway. He wouldn't quite meet my eyes. He gestured to two young men in bright green polo shirts, their arms full of empty cardboard boxes. The air, which usually smelled of sawdust and honest work, suddenly felt cold and thin. This office was more than just a room. It was where Frank and I drank our morning coffee, the steam fogging up the glass. It was where we counted the day's earnings, our fingers dusty with cash. My whole life was in the grain of that old oak desk, and now it was just in the way. David cleared his throat. We're putting in a customer experience hub, you know, with tablets and a coffee machine. He still wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the wall behind me, where Frank's old sales awards used to hang. It's about bringing the store into the 21st century. A customer experience hub. Frank would have just called it a good counter and a friendly face. I saw a dusty box on the floor by the filing cabinet. On top, placed face down, was my favorite photograph. It was Frank and me on the day we opened, him with his arm around me, both of us grinning like fools. I reached down and picked it up. The glass was cool against my fingertips. "What about this?" I asked, my voice quieter than I wanted. "We'll find a spot for it in the back," he said, already turning to direct one of the boys. "It'll be much cozier for you back there anyway." He didn't see a memory. He saw clutter. I didn't say another word. I just turned and walked out of the office, past the aisles of shiny new tools and the smell of fresh paint. I climbed the familiar wooden stairs to my little apartment above the store. The floorboards creaked under my feet, a sound that used to comfort me. Now it just sounded old. I could hear them downstairs, the scrape of my desk being dragged across the floor. A burst of laughter from one of the young men. The sounds echoed up through the vents, each one a small, sharp betrayal. I sat down at my kitchen table and looked at the mail. A white envelope with a government seal was on top, my social security statement. I opened it. The number was small, barely enough for groceries and my Medicare premium. It was the little dividend I got from the store that kept my head above water. Without the store, without my place in it, I wasn't sure what I had left. That evening, my daughter-in-law, Susan, brought me up a plate from their dinner. It was covered in plastic wrap, still warm. She set it on the table with a bright, brittle smile. "I saved you some of the pot roast, Margaret. Thought you might be tired after all the changes." I just nodded. I didn't have much of an appetite. "Isn't it exciting?" she went on, smoothing her perfectly ironed blouse. "David has such a vision for the future. You must be so proud of him." I looked at the plate. The gravy was already starting to form a skin. He even sold that dusty old workbench that was cluttering up the back. Got a great price for it from some collector online. The fork I was holding slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the floor. Frank's workbench. The one he built by hand from a single piece of oak the year we were married. The next morning, I found David down on the sales floor, directing the placement of a sleek metal display rack. The air smelled of cleaning fluid. "The workbench," I said, without any preamble. He glanced over, a little annoyed at the interruption. "What about it, Mom?" "Susan said you sold it." "Yeah, I did. Got $500 for it. Can you believe it? For a pile of old wood." He wiped his hands on a rag tucked into his jeans and smiled, like he was proud of himself. "That's $500 we can put toward the new espresso machine." I just stared at him. I remembered the day Frank got a splinter from that bench. and I spent an hour digging it out with a needle by the light of the kitchen lamp. I remembered our son, a little boy then, sitting on that bench, watching his father work, his small hands trying to hold a hammer twice his size. "Your father built that bench, David," I said. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were blank. "I know," he said, his voice flat. "But it was just old wood, Mum. We got good money for it." He turned back to the display rack, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. He didn't understand. He didn't see a single thing. That Tuesday was my bridge club day. We met in the church basement, where the air always smelled like stale coffee and lemon polish. The ladies were already shuffling the cards, the plastic clicking a familiar rhythm against the folding tables. "You're awfully quiet today, Margaret," Betty said, laying down her first card. "Everything all right at the store?" I forced a small smile. "Just a little tired, that's all." I couldn't tell them. I couldn't say the words. That my own son was pushing me out of the life Frank and I had built. The shame of it felt like a heavy wool coat on a summer day. I fumbled my cards, my mind a million miles away. Across the table, my best friend Carol caught my eye. She didn't say a word, but her look was full of a gentle worry that knew my smile was a lie. She just gave a tiny nod, as if to say, "I'm here." It was the only kindness I'd felt all week. A few days later, I was downstairs in the hardware aisle. Mr. Peterson, who'd been buying his tomato steaks from us since 1982, was trying to figure out which new kind of fertilizer to use. I knew his garden like the back of my hand. "The organic kind is better for your soil, Bill," I started to say, reaching for a bag. "Remember how your beans struggled last year?" Suddenly, David was there, a tight, bright smile plastered on his face. He put a hand on my arm, his grip just a little too firm. "Let the young guys handle that, Mom," he said, his voice loud enough for Mr. Peterson to hear. "You go on upstairs and rest." He steered me away like I was a confused child who had wandered off. I saw the look of pity on Mr. Peterson's face before he turned back to the shelf. David was treating me like a fragile old woman, a relic to be stored away. And he was doing it right in front of everyone. That Sunday, David and Susan insisted I come over for a family dinner. Susan made a pot roast, the kind I taught her how to make years ago. The smell of it filled their pristine, modern kitchen. We made small talk through the meal, about the weather, about my grandkids' school projects. It all felt rehearsed. After the plates were cleared, David sat back in his chair. He and Susan exchanged a look. "Mum," he began, "Susan and I have been talking. We've come up with a wonderful solution for you." He slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a rough floor plan, drawn in pencil. "We want you to move out of the apartment," he said gently, "for your safety. We thought you could take the small storeroom in the back. We'll convert it into a cozy suite for you." I just stared at the drawing. The storeroom. The place we kept the 50-pound bags of rock salt and the dented cans of old paint. It was small, cold, and had no windows. For a moment I couldn't breathe. Susan jumped in, her voice syrupy sweet. "It would be so much safer for you, Margaret. No stairs to climb. We'd be right there if you needed anything." She patted my hand, which was ice cold on the warm wooden table. "Think of it. You'd be so snug." Safer. That's the word she used. But I knew what it really meant. They didn't just want me out of the office. They didn't just want me out of the apartment Frank and I had shared for 40 years. They wanted me out of sight. A problem to be tucked away in a dark little corner where no one had to see me. The next morning, David found me in my apartment, packing a small box of Frank's old books. He came in without knocking. He had that same patient, practiced smile on his face, The one a doctor uses before giving you bad news. So, have you thought about our idea? He asked, leaning against the doorframe. I kept my back to him. I'm thinking, I said, my voice flat. He sighed, a sound full of manufactured concern. Look, Mum, we need an answer by the end of the month. The contractors need to get started. He paused, then delivered the final blow. It's time for the old ways to go. He left me standing there, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I looked around the apartment, at the worn armchair where Frank used to sit, at the sunlight streaming through the window that they wanted to take from me. The humiliation finally burned away the grief, and something cold and hard took its place. This was not a negotiation. This was war. I started cleaning out my apartment the next day. I felt heavy and defeated, like a balloon that had lost all its air. I began with the closet, packing Frank's old sweaters into a donation box. They still smelled faintly of him, a mix of sawdust and old spice. Each sweater was a memory I had to fold away. After an hour, I couldn't do it anymore. I needed to tackle something without a soul. I knelt down and opened the old floor safe hidden under a braided rug. The metal door groaned. Frank and I kept our most important papers in there. Marriage license, birth certificates, car titles. My fingers, stiff with arthritis, sifted through the envelopes. Way in the back, I felt a thick file. It was heavier than the others. I pulled it out. On the tab, in Frank's neat block letters, it read, Property Deed, 1 Shortine Main Street. I carried the file to my kitchen table. The morning sun streamed through the window, lighting up the dust motes dancing in the air. I poured a cup of coffee that had been sitting on the burner for too long. It tasted bitter, but I didn't care. I put on my reading glasses and pulled out the thick, creamy paper. With my magnifying glass, I went over every line, every bit of legal nonsense my eyes could handle. The first document was the business transfer. Henderson Hardware, LLC. It was all there in black and white. Signed over to David 5 years ago, fair and square. But the other document, that was different. It was the deed for the land itself. The actual dirt and concrete that the store was built on. It wasn't in David's name. It was in a trust. And when I read the name of the sole trustee, a little shiver went down my spine. Margaret Henderson. Me. A strange warmth spread through my chest. It wasn't hope. Not yet. It was something sharper, something with an edge. An idea, dangerous and thrilling, sparked in my mind like a faulty wire. I suddenly heard my Frank's voice, as clear as if he were sitting across from me. Never give away the land, Maggie, he used to say, tapping the table for emphasis. It's the one thing they can't make more of. David had the business, but I had the ground beneath his feet. They decided my story was over, I thought to myself. They forgot I was still holding the pen. I stood up and went to the little drawer where I keep the phone book. I looked up the number for a real estate lawyer my friend Carol had used last year. I bought a cheap pay-as-you-go phone from the drugstore, the kind teenagers use. It felt silly and sneaky, but I didn't want the call on my regular phone bill. I walked to the park and sat on a cold bench before I dialed the lawyer's office. I made an appointment for the following Tuesday. When I got back, David saw me in the hallway. "Where you been, Mum?" he asked, not really looking at me. "I have a doctor's appointment across town next week," I said. "Just went to confirm the bus route. The lie slid out so easily, it scared me a little." That night, I gathered the papers, the deed, the trust documents, and a copy of the business transfer. I put them in a large manila envelope that felt as heavy as a brick. Mr. Davies's office didn't feel like a law office. It was warm, with wood shelves full of books and a big window that looked out onto an oak tree. He was a kind-looking man in his 50s, with a gentle smile. He didn't rush me. He poured me a glass of water and waited while I laid my documents on his big, polished desk. He read them in silence, his face calm. The only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. After a long time, he looked up at me over his glasses. "Well, Mrs. Henderson," he said, his voice even, "it's all very clear. You have absolute control over this property. You can lease it, you can mortgage it, or you can sell it." He leaned forward slightly. "The question is, what do you want to do?" For the first time, I let myself say the words out loud. I want to explore my options. I walked home from the lawyer's office feeling 10 pounds lighter. The sun felt warm on my face for the first time in weeks. I let myself into the store, the little bell above the door jingling the same tune it had for 40 years. The air smelled of sawdust and fresh paint, a smell that used to feel like home. Now it just felt like a memory. I walked the aisles, not as a doting mother, but as a landowner. I noted the empty hooks where popular items should be. I watched customers wander out without buying anything. My son was good at making things look modern, but he wasn't frank. He didn't have the knack for it. As I stood near the plumbing section, I saw a man in a crisp blue polo shirt looking around. He wasn't shopping. He was measuring the aisles with his eyes. I recognized the logo on his shirt. It was Big Box Builders, the huge competitor that had opened a mile down the road. He caught my eye for a second, then quickly looked away, like a fox caught near the henhouse. The next morning, I decided to test the waters. I found David in my old office, his feet up on a sleek metal desk that had replaced Frank's solid oak one. The air conditioner hummed loudly. "David," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I'd like to see the quarterly profit and loss statements." He laughed. It wasn't a kind laugh. He took his feet off the desk and leaned forward, like he was explaining something to a child. "Don't you worry your head about that, Mom. I've got it covered." He looked past me, his eyes already on his computer screen. The condescension was a slap in the face. I stood there for a moment, invisible. I turned and walked out, my back straight. My son thought my name on a deed was just a memory. He was about to learn it was still a signature. I didn't have a computer in my apartment, so I took the bus to the public library. The librarian, a nice young woman named Sarah, helped me get set up on one of the public terminals. The computer hummed, and the air smelled of old paper and floor wax. I spent 2 hours looking up commercial property sales in our county. My hands trembled a little as I wrote the numbers down in my little notebook. The land. The land was worth so much more than I ever imagined. More than the store, more than the inventory, more than my son's entire vision. I looked at my social security statement in my purse. The number on it looked so small, so pathetic. A few days later, on my way to the grocery store, I saw it. A bright red "Sold" sign on the commercial lot right at the corner of Main and 3rd. It had been a dusty, empty patch of weeds for years. Now, someone had seen its potential. An idea, sharp and clear, popped into my head. I pulled out my little flip phone and took a picture of the realtor's name on the sign. When I got home, my heart thumping, I called the number. "I'm just inquiring," I told the cheerful woman who answered. "I saw you sold the corner lot. I was wondering who the biggest commercial buyers are in this area right now." There was a pause. "Well, ma'am, between you and me, one company is snapping up everything they can get. It's Big Box Builders." That night, I didn't sleep much. I made a pot of coffee before the sun was even up. I went back to the library and spent another hour online. I found the name I was looking for. Chloe Martinez, Regional Acquisitions Manager for Big Box Builders. I went to the drugstore and bought a box of nice, plain stationery and a book of stamps. Back at my kitchen table, I wrote a simple 2-sentence letter. I introduced myself as the owner of the property at 114 Main Street and said I might be open to discussing its future. I didn't sign it with David's mom. I signed it with my full name, Margaret Henderson. The next day, I drove to the post office in the next town over and dropped the letter in the big blue box. The metallic clang echoed in the quiet street. A week passed. The silence from the post office box was deafening. I started to think I was a foolish old woman playing games that were too big for me. Maybe David was right. Maybe my time was over. I'd sit by my window, watching the cars go by on Main Street, and a cold dread would creep into my bones. Then, one afternoon, I heard a loud clanking from downstairs. I walked to the top of the stairs and looked down. David was directing 2 young employees. They were hauling dusty cans of paint into the small windowless storeroom. My future cozy suite. The air smelled of rust and old chemicals. "Careful with that stack," David called out to one of the boys. He saw me standing there. He gave me a thin, impatient smile. "Just getting it ready for you, Mum," he said. "Making some space." He turned his back to me then, completely dismissing me, standing there, breathing in the dust. I felt the doubt drain right out of me. It was replaced by something hard and cold and clear. He wasn't just moving me into a back room. He was burying me. The phone rang the next morning. It was a number I didn't recognize, with a different area code. My hand trembled a little as I picked it up. My heart was doing a funny little flutter against my ribs. "Margaret Henderson?" a woman's voice asked. It was crisp and professional. "This is she," I said, trying to keep my own voice steady. "My name is Chloe Martinez. I'm the Regional Acquisitions Manager for Big Box Builders. I received your letter regarding the property at 114 Main Street." I held my breath. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock on the wall. Everything in my small apartment seemed to go quiet, waiting. "Your property is in a location we are very interested in," she said. "Very interested indeed. I'd like to meet with you to discuss it further. Would you be available next Tuesday?" We met at a quiet coffee shop in the next town over, one where nobody would know my face. The tables were small and dark, and the air smelled of roasted coffee and cinnamon. Chloe was younger than I expected, maybe in her early 40s, with a sharp suit and a kind smile that actually reached her eyes. She shook my hand firmly. "Thank you for meeting me, Mrs. Henderson," she said, after we'd ordered our coffee. "Please call me Margaret." She didn't talk down to me. She didn't use that slow, loud voice people sometimes use for seniors. She opened a folder and spoke about zoning, traffic patterns, and property values. She treated me like a business person. "Your location," she said, tapping a map with her pen, "is a strategic goldmine for our expansion plans." For the first time in years, I felt like someone saw me not as an old relic, but as a person who owned something of value. When I got back to the apartment, David was waiting for me at the bottom of the stairs. He had his arms crossed, a sour look on his face. "Where have you been, Mum?" he asked. I called a few times. "I was at a church committee meeting," I said. The lie came out smooth as butter. "We're planning the fall bake sale." He seemed to relax. His whole body softened. He came over and gave my shoulder a little pat, the way you'd pat a dog. "Good," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Keep yourself busy. That's great." He turned and walked back into the front of the store, whistling. I stood there for a long moment, the feeling of his hand still on my shoulder. He had no idea the ground was about to shift right under his feet. The next day, my lawyer, Mr. Davies, called me. He never called unless it was important. "Margaret," he said, his voice calm but serious. "I've just received an email from Ms. Martinez at Big Box Builders. She has sent over a preliminary offer." I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair. My hands were gripping the edge of the table. "And?" "And the amount is substantial," he said. He read me the number. It was so large I couldn't quite picture it. It was more money than Frank and I had made in a lifetime of hard work. It was enough to be safe, enough to be free. A wave of relief so powerful it made me dizzy, washed over me. "Margaret, are you still there?" Mr. Davies asked. "There's one other thing, a contingency." "What is it?" I asked, my voice a whisper. "The offer is contingent on the property being delivered vacant," he said. "They need the lot cleared. You would have 90 days to ensure the current tenant has vacated the premises." I sat in my car in the lawyer's parking lot for a long time. The hum of the air conditioner was the only sound. This would destroy David's business. My son. The business Frank and I poured our lives into. A wave of cold panic washed over me, so strong I felt dizzy. Was I a monster? What kind of mother does this? Then I saw it, clear as day in my mind. The dusty box with Frank's pictures, the condescending little pat on my shoulder, his voice saying, "Don't you worry your head about that, Mom." And that cold, windowless storeroom, smelling of rock salt and old paint, where he planned to put me. He made his choice a long time ago. He decided who I was to him. Now, I was making mine. Mr. Davies was a wonderful man. He called me the next day. "Margaret, I've spoken with their legal team," he said, his voice calm and professional. "They've agreed to our terms." He got them to cover every penny of my legal fees. He said it was standard in a commercial deal of this size. He also structured the sale in a way that would protect my Social Security and minimize the taxes I'd have to pay. "We want to make sure this money works for you for a very long time," he explained. It felt good to have someone smart on my side, someone who saw me as a client, not just an old woman. He saw a person with something valuable to protect. The signing was in a quiet conference room. The polished wood table reflected the ceiling lights. Mr. Davies slid the papers in front of me. There were so many pages, full of words I didn't understand. But I understood the last page. I picked up the heavy black pen they gave me. For a second, it felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Then I thought of Frank's workbench, sold off like a piece of junk. My hand was perfectly steady as I signed my name, Margaret Henderson. 2 days later, I went to the bank and asked the teller for my balance. She printed a little white slip and slid it to me. I put on my reading glasses. I had to count the zeros 3 times to believe it. I called David that afternoon. "Can you and Susan come up to the apartment tonight?" I asked. "I need to discuss something with you both." I could hear the impatience in his voice. "We're pretty busy, Mom. Can it wait?" "No, David," I said. "It can't. They showed up at 7, looking like I had interrupted their favorite television show. I had them sit at the small kitchen table, the one Frank and I ate breakfast at for 40 years. I didn't offer them coffee. I just slid a single, crisp document across the table toward them. David picked it up and squinted at it. A slow, mocking smile spread across his face. He laughed. It was not a nice sound. "Very funny, Mom. What is this really about? Are you trying to scare me into giving you the front office back?" I looked him straight in the eye. My voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. "It's a legal notice, David. The land has been sold." He kept smiling, but it froze on his face. Susan, who had been looking at her phone, slowly lifted her head. All the colour drained from her cheeks. David's face went through a whole weather report in about 10 seconds. First, confusion. Then, a flicker of disbelief. Finally, his jaw tightened, and his eyes went hard. Pure rage. "You can't do that," he shouted, slapping his hand on my little kitchen table. The salt shaker jumped. "The business is mine. I have the papers." I looked at him, my hands folded calmly in my lap. The hum of the old refrigerator suddenly seemed very loud. "The business is yours, David. Henderson Hardware LLC belongs to you completely." I paused, letting the words settle in the quiet room. Susan just stared, her mouth a perfect little O of shock. "The land it sits on," I said, my voice even and low, "is mine, and I sold it." He started screaming then, not just yelling, but a deep, ugly screaming I hadn't heard since he was a toddler who'd dropped his ice cream cone. He called me a bitter, crazy old woman. He said I was trying to ruin him. He said Frank would be ashamed of me. I sat there at my table, the one Frank and I bought 50 years ago. I just watched him. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I let his storm break all around me, a hurricane of words that couldn't touch me anymore. Susan started to cry, little hiccuping sounds, but she didn't dare say a word to him or to me. When he finally ran out of breath, his face red and blotchy, I stood up slowly. The meeting was over. I walked to the door of my apartment and held it open for them. "You have 90 days, David." News in a small town moves faster than a stray cat looking for a handout. By the time I went to my bridge game on Wednesday, everyone knew. Not the details, of course, but they knew something big had happened at Henderson Hardware. Nobody said a word directly. Instead, Dorothy brought me her famous lemon meringue pie. Betty brought a chicken and rice casserole, still warm from the oven. The smell filled my little kitchen with comfort. It was their way of taking sides without saying so. My best friend, Carol, waited until we were alone, clearing the card table. She put her warm, slightly arthritic hand over mine. She didn't ask questions. She just looked me right in the eye. "It's about time," she said, and squeezed my hand. I felt a lump in my throat, but for the first time in months, it wasn't from sadness. The very next morning, I called a moving company. The man on the phone was polite and patient. He didn't treat me like I was confused. He just asked for the address and the date. It felt good. Then I called a realtor who specialized in senior communities. She took me to see a 2-bedroom condo in a lovely 55-plus building called Sunny Meadow. It was on the ground floor, with a little patio that got the morning light. I could picture my potted geraniums there. There were no stairs. No sound of hammering from the store below. I signed the lease that afternoon. The pen felt solid and real in my hand. The quiet click it made when I was done was the sound of a door opening, not one closing. I wondered if this was what freedom felt like. David, of course, tried to fight it. Carol heard it from her cousin, who works as a paralegal downtown. David hired a fancy lawyer from the city to look at the trust documents and the property deed. He was sure he could find a loophole. He was sure our old family lawyer had made a mistake. The city lawyer read everything, charged David for 5 hours of his time, and told him what I already knew. The paperwork was ironclad. Frank had made sure of it. The business was his, but the ground beneath it was mine to do with as I pleased. The best part? David had to pay his own legal bills for the bad news. The thought almost made me smile as I packed my photo albums. The first store closing signs went up on a Tuesday. They were big and yellow, with angry red letters. I saw them from my car when I drove past on my way to the grocery store. It felt like seeing a dear friend in a hospital gown. Final. Old Mr. Abernathy was standing on the sidewalk, just staring at the front window. He'd been buying his birdseed and plumbing tape from us for 40 years. He saw me and shook his head slowly. "Maggie, what's all this?" he asked, his voice thin. I thought David was doing so well. I gave him a small, sad smile. "Things change, Arthur. Sometimes we have to make room for the new." He just kept shaking his head. I felt a sharp pang in my chest, a grief for the name Frank and I had built, for the legacy. But then I thought of the cold back room they planned for me, and the feeling passed. It wasn't regret for my decision. It was just goodbye. I started to build my new life. The moving company was careful and respectful, calling me Ma'am and placing every box exactly where I asked. My new condo smelled of fresh paint and possibility. It had a big sliding glass door that let in the afternoon sun, which warmed the wood floor. I bought a big, soft armchair, the kind you can curl up in with a book. I bought a television so large I felt like I was at the movies. On my first Wednesday there, I went to the community book club. We sat in a circle, drank weak tea from paper cups, and talked about a story set in Italy. It was simple. It was nice. That evening, I was just settling into my new chair with a blanket over my lap when the doorbell rang. It was a sharp, insistent sound. I opened it to find Susan standing there. Her eyes were red and puffy, and her hair was a mess. She looked like she hadn't slept in a week. "Can I come in, Margaret?" Susan asked, her voice trembling. I stepped aside and let her into my clean, quiet living room. She looked around, her eyes wide with something I couldn't quite name. Resentment, maybe. She wouldn't sit down. She just stood in the middle of my new rug, wringing her hands. "You have to stop this," she whispered. "David is losing his mind. Our mortgage, the kids' college funds. It's all tied up in the store. You're destroying us." I listened patiently, my hands folded in front of me. I let her say everything she needed to say. The air was thick with her panic. When she finally ran out of words, the silence was heavy. I looked her right in the eye. "You and David made your plans for my future without consulting me," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "Now I've made mine." The final payment from big box builders arrived the next Monday. The number on my bank statement had so many zeros it looked like a misprint. I just stared at it, the hum of my new refrigerator the only sound in the kitchen. It wasn't the money itself. It was the quiet, solid feeling of safety. My lawyer, Mr. Davies, had recommended a financial advisor. Her name was Eileen. She was a woman my age, with sensible shoes and a kind smile. She didn't talk down to me. She spread charts and papers on her big desk and explained everything: trusts, investments, taxes. "You are in a very strong position, Mrs. Henderson," she said, looking at me over her glasses. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe all the way out. It was a feeling of complete control. It was calm. It was powerful. My best friend, Carol, heard the news about David at her hair salon. She called me that afternoon. "Maggie, they're saying David is trying to find a new location," she said. "He's looking way out in the industrial park." "Is he?" I asked, looking out my window at the little bird feeder on my patio. "The rents on Main Street have gone through the roof since Big Box announced they were coming," she continued. "He can't afford a thing. He's telling people you lost your mind." I sighed softly. Of course he was. It was easier than telling people he'd tried to put his own mother in a storeroom. His pride wouldn't let him ask for help, and it certainly wouldn't let him tell the truth. I booked a trip I'd wanted to take my whole life, a 2-week cruise to Alaska. The first morning, I stood on my little balcony wrapped in a thick robe, holding a warm mug of coffee. The air was so cold and clean, it felt like a brand new world. We sailed past glaciers the size of mountains, the ice a shade of blue I'd never seen before. I heard them crack and groan, a deep sound that rumbled right through the ship. In the afternoons, I'd sit in a lounge chair on the deck, a wool blanket tucked around my legs, and write postcards. I sent one to Carol with a picture of a grizzly bear. I sent another to my bridge club ladies showing a pod of whales. I told them about the food, the friendly people I'd met, and the quiet. I wrote until my fingers were stiff from the cold. There was one postcard left, a picture of a lonely, beautiful lighthouse. I thought about sending it to David and Susan, but I couldn't think of a single thing to write. I tucked it back into my bag. When the taxi dropped me off at my new condo, the air felt warm and thick after Alaska. I unpacked my bags, putting my little souvenirs on the bookshelf. The next day, I had to run to the pharmacy, and I took the long way, down Main Street. I had to see it. The building was still there, but it looked like a hollowed-out shell. The big, friendly red letters spelling Henderson Hardware were gone. You could see their ghosts on the brick, a lighter shade where they had protected it from the sun for 50 years. The windows were dark and empty. I pulled my car over to the curb, my hands tight on the steering wheel. It hurt more than I expected. It felt like looking at a gravestone. And then I saw the new sign, stretched right across the front of the store, a huge vinyl banner with loud, flashy letters. It said, "Coming soon. Big Box Builders." My world didn't shrink into a back room. It got bigger. I started volunteering at the public library on Tuesdays and Thursdays, reading to the little ones for story hour. The room always smelled like old paper and that lemon floor polish they use. The children would sit on the brightly coloured rug, their eyes wide, and sometimes a little one would crawl into my lap. "Read it again, please," a little girl with pigtails whispered, her small hand resting on my arm. On Friday nights, my condo building had a potluck in the community room. I'd bring my green bean casserole, the one Frank always loved. I made new friends. There was a retired teacher named Alice and a widower named George who told the worst jokes but had the kindest eyes. We'd sit and talk about our grandkids and our gardens and the rising price of eggs. I was Margaret again, not just David's mother who needed to be put away. Carol called me one afternoon. "Margaret, have you heard about David's new place?" she asked, her voice soft. I told her I hadn't. "It's way out in the industrial park," she said. "Past the old canning factory. It's one of those metal buildings, no windows to speak of." She told me he had to let go of Jim and Carlos, men who had worked for Frank and me for over 20 years. I pictured the new store, a small, sad box in a part of town nobody ever visited. I felt a sharp pang in my chest, a ghost of the pride I once had. Henderson Hardware was a shadow. It was the business he had wanted so badly, but he had torn out its heart to get it. A few weeks later, a letter came in the mail. It was a proper letter, in a real envelope, not a bill. The return address was my granddaughter Sarah's dorm at the university. I sat at my kitchen table and opened it with my silver letter opener. The sun streamed in through the clean window, landing on the pot of geraniums on my sill. Sarah's handwriting was round and neat, just like when she was a little girl. She told me about her classes and a boy she liked. Then the tone changed. She said her parents were fighting all the time, mostly about money. She said the house felt cold and quiet. At the very end, she asked, "Grandma, would it be okay if I came to visit you for my spring break? I can take the bus?" I didn't even finish the letter. I picked up the phone right then and called her. "Of course, sweetheart," I said. "My home is your home." My granddaughter Sarah came for her spring break. It was the first time I'd had a guest in my new home, and my heart felt full to bursting. We didn't talk about her parents. We didn't need to. Instead, we filled the sunny little kitchen with the smell of cinnamon and sugar as we baked my mother's recipe for snickerdoodles. "Grandma, these are the best," she said, her mouth full, leaning against the counter. "It's all in the cream of tartar," I told her, just like my own mother told me. That evening, we curled up on my new sofa under a soft chenille blanket and watched old black and white movies. She showed me how to use the streaming service on my television and didn't make me feel foolish for not knowing. Her presence was a balm. It felt like I was rebuilding my family, one cookie and one old movie at a time, on my own terms. It was a good feeling, a solid one. A few days after Sarah left, I went back to see Mr. Davies, my lawyer. I had been thinking hard about the future, about what real security meant. It wasn't just about me anymore. I sat across from him at his polished desk, the faint smell of old books and coffee in the air. "I want to set up a trust fund," I said, my voice steady, "for my grandchildren's education." He nodded, listening intently. "A very wise decision, Margaret." "I want it to be ironclad," I continued, looking him straight in the eye. "David and Susan cannot be trustees. They cannot touch a penny of it. The money is to go directly to the schools for tuition and books. No exceptions." Mr. Davies made a note. "I understand completely." He smiled a little. "We can certainly arrange that." I signed the papers he prepared, and I knew I was buying something more valuable than land. I was buying my grandchildren a choice, a future their parents couldn't take away. I saw David at the grocery store the next week. I was in the canned goods aisle, trying to decide between crushed or diced tomatoes, when I saw him at the far end, near the bread. He looked tired. There were new lines around his eyes, and his shoulders had a slump I'd never seen before. He looked 10 years older than he had just a few months ago. Our eyes met for just a second. A flicker of something, shame, maybe anger, crossed his face. He didn't say a word. He just turned his cart around so abruptly that a box of cereal nearly fell out. He hurried down the next aisle, away from me. There was no triumph in it, no feeling of victory, just a quiet, heavy sadness for the son I raised and the man he had become. When Thanksgiving rolled around, my new condo was filled with noise and warmth. I decided to host a dinner for my chosen family. Carol came, of course, along with 2 other ladies from my bridge club. I also invited a lovely couple from down the hall, George and Eleanor. The table was crowded with mismatched plates and serving spoons, and the air smelled of roast turkey and sage stuffing. "To Margaret," Carol said, raising her glass of sparkling cider. "And to new beginnings." Everyone echoed her toast. The sound of their laughter filled my small dining room. I looked around at their smiling faces, at the simple joy of a shared meal. This was my life now. It wasn't the life I had planned with Frank all those years ago, but it was a good life, a peaceful one. A week before Christmas, a thick card arrived in the mail. The return address was David and Susan's, but the handwriting was my granddaughter's. Inside was a photo of Sarah, smiling on her college campus, snow dusting the trees behind her. She had written, "Thank you, Grandma. You've given me a future." My eyes welled up. Tucked behind the photo was another piece of paper, folded small. It was a short, stilted note in David's handwriting. The words looked like they had been hard to write. It just said, "I'm sorry." I looked at the Christmas card for a long time. The paper felt thin and cheap in my hands. Tucked inside, David's short, stilted note was written in a hurry. "I'm sorry." Just 2 words. There was no explanation, no real apology for the years of being pushed aside. It felt like a stone skipped across a deep lake, barely touching the surface. My friend Carol came over for coffee that afternoon. I showed her the note. "Well, it's a start," she said, peering at it over her reading glasses. "Is it?" I asked, folding the card and putting it on the counter. "Or is it just something to make himself feel better?" Carol stirred her coffee, the little spoon clinking against the ceramic mug. She didn't answer right away. She just looked at me, a long, steady look that said she understood. The note didn't need a reply. Not yet, anyway. I decided forgiveness wasn't a door you just open. It was a path you walked, and I wasn't ready to take the first step. A few weeks later, the new big box builders opened. It was all over the local paper. The grand opening was a huge event with a ribbon cutting and balloons that I could almost see from my patio. The phone rang that morning, and it was Chloe, the acquisitions manager. Her voice was bright and professional. "Mrs. Henderson, I know this might be forward, but we'd be honored if you'd come today," she said, "as a guest of honor." I pictured the bright, overwhelming lights and the smell of fresh paint. I thought of my old office, now probably a display for power tools. "That's very kind of you, Chloe," I said, my voice even. "But that chapter of my life is over. I wish you all the best." "I understand completely," she said, and she sounded like she really did. After I hung up, I walked out onto my patio. I could hear the faint sound of celebration music carried on the wind. It sounded very, very far away. That spring, I decided to start a small container garden on my new patio. I bought big terracotta pots from the garden center, the rough clay feeling solid under my fingers. I spent a whole afternoon in the warm sun, scooping dark, rich potting soil and carefully placing the tender roots of geraniums and marigolds. The smell of the earth was clean and honest. My new neighbor, a gentleman named Arthur who walked with a cane, stopped by my railing. "Putting down some new roots, are we?" he asked with a friendly smile. "I certainly am," I said, patting the soil around a bright red flower. "It's about time," he nodded, leaning on his cane. "A garden is good for the soul. It doesn't talk back." We both had a little chuckle at that. As I watered my new plants, I felt a deep satisfaction. I was nurturing something that was entirely mine. My granddaughter called me every Sunday. During one call, her voice was different, softer. "Grandma," she said, "Dad is different now." I waited, listening to the hum of the phone line. "Different how, dear?" "He's just quieter. He listens more. Mum says he lost all his bluster." She paused. "I think he's finally realized what he threw away." I thought of the man who told me it was time for the old ways to go. "That's good to hear, honey," I said, and I meant it. But a few quiet weeks didn't erase years of being made to feel small. People can change, but I had learned that seeing is believing. Actions, I thought to myself, always speak louder than words. This morning I woke up early. The sun was just starting to warm the tiles on my patio. I made myself a cup of Earl Grey tea, the steam fogging up my glasses for a moment. I sat in my comfortable cushioned chair, the one I picked out myself, and looked at my little garden. The geraniums were in full, shameless bloom, a riot of red and pink. A little finch landed on the railing, chirped a hello, and flew away. The air was quiet, filled only with the promise of a peaceful day. I am not a dusty photograph in a box. I am not a problem to be stored in a back room. I am Margaret Henderson, and for the first time in a long time, I am simply, quietly, wonderfully free.